The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, Labor supports the Arms Military-Style Semi-Automatic Firearms and Import Controls Amendment Bill. And it was interesting to see, Mr Speaker, the real level of interest in the people wanting to make submissions on this issue. There were some 257 written submissions, of which 71 people were heard before the Select Committee. I think this is pretty much a reflection of New Zealand as a country where traditionally a lot of people have been keen on hunting. We've got nearly 230,000 people who are licensed to own firearms, and I would declare my interest as being one of those persons, Mr Speaker. I use firearms for pest control on my farm, and when I get the chance I enjoy deer stalking. I think that we do have a problem with firearms in this country, but not one that's being addressed by this bill. The worry that I have actually isn't encompassed by this bill at all. It's the fact with regular monotony this year, we have seen the inadvertent shooting of one hunter by another hunter that hasn't followed the basic rules of firearm ownership, and that is identify your target. And I know when I hunt with professionals how carefully they take the issue of safety. There is no room for risk. And if we were spending time in the House on anything tonight, it perhaps should be on how we can ensure that people who get licensed to be firearm owners actually understand the need to treat lethal weapons with the respect they deserve. The debate at the Select Committee was pretty much about a balance of rights. The rights of New Zealanders on one hand to legitimately own firearms to use for pest control or for hunting, versus the right of the public to be protected against the proliferation of weapons in the hands of people who are improper people to hold those weapons. And if we look at the history of this country, sir, we see that we have not been without incidents where there have been mass slaughter of people by individuals sometimes for reasons of mental health or whatever. The case, I think, of David Stanley early in the century. He didn't have a military-style semi-automatic, sir. He had a single-shot rifle, but nevertheless killed 10 people, including a number of policemen. We think of David Gray, and of course, not in New Zealand, sir, but within our recent memory, we think of Anders Breivik, and he did have semi-automatic military-style weapons, and he was able to engage in the mass slaughter of innocent people in a way that horrifies every member of this House. So the need for balance is very clear. Mr Speaker, the bill does four things, and I endorse each of the purposes that are set out. First of all, it makes the definition of what a military-style semi-automatic is. And this was thrown into some doubt with a High Court decision, I think in Palmerston North, by Justice Mallon, which the police said created uncertainty as to how you define a military-style semi-automatic. Well, the definition, I think, under this bill is pretty clear. A firearm which, after being loaded, fires and ejects a cartridge case and chambers another cartridge with each pull of the trigger. That's the semi-automatic side of it. And the military style of it is set out, sir, in other characteristics, a magazine that contains either 10 or 15 rounds and a firearm that has a pistol grip. I support that definition, sir. I also support the allowance of regulations to be made to alter that definition. Regulations can be a useful tool of government to respond immediately and without the detailed process of passage of legislation. But that, sir, has in itself some risks. When you make changes by regulation, you deprive the public of a chance to make submissions on the legislation. That's an important part of democracy. And you also deprive this House of the ability to scrutinise whether those regulations are justified. I think the Select Committee did the right thing in saying that this was a restricted power to make regulations, that there needed to be subordinate validating legislation brought in within a specified period of time, and I think that finds the appropriate balance. Thirdly, Mr Speaker, it allows an appeal to the District Court where a firearms owner believes that his or her firearm has wrongly been classified as a military-style semi-automatic. And fourthly, but not the least of the provisions in this bill, it provides a restriction on the importation of air guns that have the appearance of being either a restricted weapon, a pistol, or a military-style semi-automatic. And it was of concern to the Select Committee that the police on a weekly basis, literally, are dealing with cases where somebody brandishes a firearm that could be mistaken for being a lethal weapon. And this happens sometimes, sir, by people who are drunk or drugged, and the police are cast in a hugely unfortunate situation of seeing somebody with a weapon that may be lethal. Their life might be in danger, the life of other innocent people might be in danger, and on perhaps rare occasions, the individual with an imitation firearm can end up being shot. And I think it makes sense to prevent the importation of air guns that could be mistaken for being real weapons. The police take these incidents very seriously. It's a priority response. It involves armed police. It sometimes involves the Armed Defenders Squad. They believe that this is a change that is appropriate, and I agree with the position that they've taken. Mr. Speaker, another issue at the Select Committee was the question of community input into the making of regulations and legislation. And I know a lot of the leaders in the hunting community, and I know them to be responsible people, and I know them to be people with a detailed knowledge and expertise, which means that their input into the technical side of legislation and regulations could be really helpful. Labor supports the setting up of a statutory body where people can give advice on this sort of legislation. But we were told that making an amendment to the legislation was beyond the scope of this bill, and it was also a matter of common sense that if you're going to set up a statutory advisory body, it's not on a very narrow range of issues such as we're addressing in the House tonight. It's on the wider area of proper legislation and regulation of firearms in the community. So I think we maintain our support for the idea of having a statutory advisory body, and we would certainly support the recommendation of the Select Committee that this is something that does need attention, albeit not in this bill as it is set out. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish on the ACT minority view in this bill, because when I read it, I thought it had been a submission by the National Riflemen's Association from the United States, which takes the approach that it is an absolute right for any individual to control a lethal weapon, and that the state has no role in interference with that right. I beg to differ, Mr. Speaker. I have seen the results, as every member of this House has seen, of such a policy in the United States, where you can go in many states to a store without a permit, purchase a pistol that can be concealed, purchase a military-style automatic weapon, and time and again we have seen the tragic consequences of such a policy. And I want to say to the ACT Party, get real. Make sure that in this country we can have legislation that applies proper restrictions without unduly restricting the legitimate right of responsible people in this country to use firearms. And it's a reflection on a party that gets less than 1% in the polls, actually 0% at the moment, that they take such an extreme libertarian view. I believe this legislation, by comparison, gets the balance right, Mr. Speaker, which is why the Labor Party will be supporting this bill through to its third reading.
I call Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr.